This is a production of Cornell University.
Great. Well, I just want to say thanks to Jenny for inviting me, and to Lucille and Juping for doing all the logistics. So I really appreciate all the effort. So thanks. I'm just going to give kind of an overview of myself and who I am, and then the Land Institute and what we do, and then my program at the Land Institute in particular. Hopefully for the students who I met with prior to this, it's not super boring because they've already heard a lot of it at this point. But I think it's really important to think about all of the things that happen sort of adjacent to plant breeding that make plant breeding effective in the world. And I think that's kind of the summary of the work that I do. So let me see if I can. Okay, so first I'll just talk a little bit about my background and who I am. Obviously I work at the Land Institute, but I started out in other places. I actually did my bachelor's in physics and math, and worked as a geophysicist for an oil field services company for many years. So I think this is actually one of the vessels that I worked on. We were a company that builds maps of the subsurface geology of the ocean floor and then sells them to oil companies, essentially. And I got to travel a lot. It was really good. In that sense, it really helped me be exposed to different cultures. And when I worked in like 20 countries and 5 different continents. And at that time, it really gave me a strong interest in food and food systems. So these are some of my favorite dishes from some of my favorite countries that I got to visit. I found myself talking to people at markets a lot, visiting farms. I just became really interested in agriculture and food systems at that point. But I was tired of living on a boat and got tired of traveling all the time. I was lonely, so I ended up quitting that job and moved and started working on a farm in Ecuador, where I really became interested in both organic farming and seed systems and seed sovereignty. So that was the first time I'd ever thought about seed and where seed came from. And so became really inspired by the folks who were doing that work. So I came back to the US. I was at that time living in Ecuador. And as I told the students this morning, I was not cut out for living in the tropics. I need a seasonal die-off of insects that are biting in particular. So I moved back to a higher latitude, to Wyoming, where I originally lived, and did a second bachelor's in agroecology at the University of Wyoming, primarily taking some agricultural and soils courses and things so that I could get into grad school at the University of Wisconsin, where I did a PhD in plant breeding and plant genetics. I worked with Organic Seed Alliance for about 9 months after my PhD, where I really was focused on looking at kind of the economics of seed systems. So building enterprise budgets for different seed crops, thinking through like the planning and seed scale up and seed systems and things like that, which gave me kind of a unique skill set, I think, to work with the Land Institute. I was hired as the commercialization manager, but as that program developed, it was sort of, and as our mission and vision kind of came into alignment, it was clear that we weren't really interested in becoming a seed company or a vertically integrated grain company or something like that, that we were really committed to staying a research organization. And so rather than commercialization, we moved into stewardship and crop stewardship. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. The Land Institute itself is a 501c3, primarily philanthropically funded. We are we do have some funds from government grants, and those are generally like, restricted to specific projects, but the primary, kind of operating funds for the organization are through philanthropic dollars. Our work is done in central Kansas, kind of smack in the middle of Kansas, on the Pawnee, Osage, and Kaw lands. Our mission is to develop a perennial, diverse agriculture that saves soil from being poisoned and lost while promoting a community life at once prosperous and enduring. So this is kind of a big mission, right? We have everything from social science to plant breeding and soil ecology and things. And I'll talk about kind of each of the individual programs here in a little bit. Why we do this, each place and each of the collaborators that we work with will have kind of a different why about how this work impacts them. So this is a photograph of Kansas, where the biggest kind of issue facing producers is soil erosion. So this is an annual wheat field on the left, and a Kernza field on the right after a rain. So you can see just the washout of topsoil. So that's sort of the why of perennial grain crops in Kansas. In Minnesota, the why is more related to nitrates in drinking water. So the folks that we work with there are really concerned with water quality and drinking water. So the Minnesota Department of Ag, for example, funds a lot of Kernza plantings on wellhead protection areas and things like that to help remediate water that has high nitrate levels. In places like Ukraine, we have collaborators who are really interested in resilience to sociopolitical disruption. So for annual grains, if you weren't able to get in your field because of the invasion of Russia, there's the potential that a perennial may have been able to be more resilient to that sociopolitical upheaval. And then in places like Colorado, we're working with producers and researchers who are really interested in the tolerance to drought and also to, just limited irrigation and different shutoff dates and, essentially the recovery of these perennial grain plants compared with annuals in times of drought stress. So this is sort of why are we looking at perennial grains and why are we focused on perennial agriculture? We want to build systems for agriculture that mimic natural systems that have the kind of resiliency to these disruptions, whether they're sociopolitical or climate related. Of course, perennials, why they're resilient to this is that, you have reduced need for tillage, reduced soil loss from erosion. As you can see on the left here, this is a perennial wheat. So this is a hybrid between intermediate wheatgrass and durum wheat, and the roots are much longer than the annual winter wheat. So we're looking at, potentially increased carbon. Excuse me if I have to cough. I'm recovering from COVID. So, increased water infiltration and carbon storage, pollutant runoff, soil organic matter, increased weed competition that can reduce the need for spraying, and then of course like increased biodiversity in terms especially of the soil microbial community and the kinds of above ground like animals and nesting birds and other like nesting insects that benefit from reduced tillage. So we do this through 5 different program areas. So the first thing that we do is we develop perennial grain crops. So this top grain is perennial rice. We've collaborated for many years with Yunnan University in China. They have released several varieties of perennial rice that have resulted in yields that are similar to annual rice yields, and at this point, I think they've had 8 harvests from these fields that have this perennial rice. Silphium integrifolium is a crop that's native to, which is this next one to the left, is a crop that's native to the United States, so central, kind of the Central Plains, basically from the Appalachians to the Rocky Mountains. The common name is rosinweed. We've been looking at it as a potential oilseed crop for about 20 years, and are also looking at some of the protein functionality and its use as potential dual use for forage and biomass production. We look at dual cropping systems or multi-cropping systems. So Cura clover is a crop that we're really interested in learning about how to grow crops in mixtures, in diverse mixtures. So right now we have what we call a perennial ground cover program that's looking at Cura clover as a perennial grain, or sorry, as a perennial ground cover that you could plant and then plant things like corn or soy into without having to turn over the soil. Perennial wheat is a hybrid, as I mentioned before, between intermediate wheatgrass and durum wheat. And so we're looking at developing that as a perennial grain crop. So far, we've been able to achieve 2 years of yield from perennial wheat. We haven't gotten to that 3rd year. And for us, 3 years is the minimum for considering something a perennial. This crop here is perennial sainfoin, or sorry, perennial sorghum, which is a crop that is being worked on. We have a plant breeder who is housed at the University of Georgia, and she's working on developing perennial sorghum. And it's been pretty successful in Uganda. A lot of our collaborators in Africa have had good success with adoption of the crop. And then sainfoin is this next crop. It's a legume that's been grown primarily as a forage crop in the West, so kind of Montana to Idaho, Wyoming, that area, and then up into Canada as well. And so we're looking at actually eating the grain or the seed from this crop. It's nutritionally sort of similar to chickpea, but it looks like a small lentil. I don't know what clover this is, so I'm going to skip over that. And then this crop in the top right is kernza. So this is the seed or grain from intermediate wheatgrass that we've been working on at the Land Institute for about 20 years. We also look at perennial polycultures. So we're looking at growing alfalfa and intermediate wheatgrass or kernza together in mixtures to try and provide nitrogen for the kernza from this intercropping method. And that's kind of our ecological intensification program works on that. They also work on diseases and pests of perennial grain crops. So they're looking at that as well. And we have an ecosphere studies program that's really focused on the human learning aspects and the cultural development that has to happen to adopt perennial grain crops. We have an international program that is aimed really at developing new research connections with different countries all over the world to bring more breeding programs for perennial grains into existence. And then we have the crop stewardship program, which is the program that I lead. And so I'll delve a little bit more in depth into that. So our goal is to bring nature's economy into line with the human economy. And our goal is to steward diverse perennial grain crops to farms and forks for maximum positive impact. This kind of comes straight from the mission of the Land Institute. To do this, it takes a pretty robust set of things to have happen. We have to have an innovation and a whole package of innovations that go with it folks have to adopt that and start bringing it onto the landscape. We have to scale that. And then we also have to have this portion, of being seen as legitimate. So for crop stewardship, we really work on like the civic and political aspects of that. So we have like a policy and government affairs person who works on that work. To do this, when we talk about like the innovation, what is the innovation? So first of all, it's a new crop. In this picture, it's Silphium integrifolium, and these are some researchers that are collaborators from Argentina. We need a new cropping system, so a new way to grow these crops together. We need a new way to think about and value the crops, so people have to want to eat them and they have to be willing to buy them. We have to have new ways to get them to market. So what kinds of products are they going to go into? We have to have new ways of kind of understanding how these things interact. So the genetic, agronomic, and cultural aspects of evolution that allow a crop to come onto the landscape and be enjoyed. We're also thinking about new ways of sharing power. So right now, the Land Institute owns the trademark license, so the trademark on the name Kernza. And we're working on developing a perpetual purpose trust that would allow actually anyone who has a licensing agreement to be a partial owner of the trademark and to benefit from any money or aspects that are coming back to this group. And we also, really have to understand our relationship to the places where these are grown and have that be a part of what we do. So the whole thing, is a new type of agriculture and a new system. So this is a picture of the perennial rice in China. So this requires an entirely new system. This work is really based in kind of this literature around socio-technical transitions towards sustainability. A lot of this work has been done in things like solar energy and alternative energy, but we're looking at how what has been learned from those new marketplaces and new developments, how that can be transitioned and transferred to new crop development. So like I said, it's a whole system. It's not just the kind of core technology, but it's also like the infrastructure and the supply chain, all of the people. It's the understanding of the goals and procedures and processes, and an entire kind of cultural shift that allows for this to happen. And that usually looks a lot messier than the picture before. So I just want to show, that what it actually looks like is something like this. We have suppliers, user groups, and there are connections between all of these things going all over the place. I'm going to use Kernza as sort of the example of how this work is getting done in real time. This is generally action research. So we are doing the research, but we're not sort of like sitting back and waiting for things to happen and then like analyzing the results. We're actively trying to predict what has to come next and act on it. So Kernza is a new variety, a new variety. This sort of represents what we call the innovation package. So all of these things have to be, all of these things have to happen and have to be in place to make sure that Kernza goes onto the landscape and scales on the landscape. So each of these pieces is a part of the innovation package. So we have to have agronomics and best practices. We have to have food science and understand everything from like storage methods to like recipes, product development, markets, all of that, policy and infrastructure. So making sure that the grain can actually be sold to humans, that it's safe for them to eat. We do a lot of that risk assessment work. And then we work on like new ownership models and governance techniques. So I feel like this can be well represented by the Liebig's law of the minimum, which sort of is this idea that when you're moving this technology package into the world, whatever the minimum is, whichever piece is the least developed of those things that we just talked about, that is going to stifle the adoption of the entire package. It's going to mean that we have to address that and try and find some way of making sure that, this barrel can hold more water. So we want to make sure that like no single piece of the innovation can actually move forward without having all of it in place. And so we really work in crop stewardship on identifying what is that next limiting factor, how do we address it, and taking action to try and address it. So that's sort of the action research piece of what we do. And then we get to kind of adoption. So this requires that we have really a good understanding, not just of like each of the individual innovation packages. So we might have seed and have the seed available, but making sure that we really understand, what is behind the rural community who comes to this crop and might want to work with this crop, and how is it going to be successful on their particular farm with their particular management system and all of those things. One of the things that we really have to think about is that why that I talked about earlier, where you're thinking about, the whether it's nitrates in the water, whether it's erosion, things like that, making sure that we really understand that so that we can make recommendations about how to adopt these crops in a way that is actually going to address that underlying reason for the community. So this adoption framework is technology transfer. So this is something, there's a lot of research about responsible technology transfer, and we really try to bring this to the action research, which is the adoption. So we try to pair those two things in our work. We want to make sure that we develop relevant knowledge, that we present it to communities in a way that makes sense and is accessible to them, and that we then have the hardware to kind of back it up, whether that hardware looks like, a new variety of Kernza or new processing infrastructure for making sure that like it gets dehulled and cleaned to specifications. We do this through this like wave of technology transfer. When we think about it, early on, you've really got these innovators, and then you have these folks who are early adopters. You have to get through this kind of we call it in the literature, it's the trough of disillusionment. And I have conversations with folks that are very much about this kind of trough of disillusionment. So I have to sort of make sure that I understand, okay, we're having a conversation about the trough of disillusionment at times. We're really in this like somewhere between probably early innovators and early adopters right now with Kernza. It's been about 20 years and that we've been working on this crop. So if you consider, wheat has been being used by humans for about 10,000 years, we're really early in kind of the trajectory. So we're really working on getting toward kind of this early majority and through this trough of disillusionment. So another way to think of it is called the Valley of Death. This is the place where we're trying to go from like philanthropic or government funded agencies and get through this technology transfer to where we have private sector investment and larger diffusion or scaling. So this is kind of where my team and I live on the daily, is in this Valley of Death, where intermediary is trying to like put those things together. So scaling processes, so that diffusion piece, if you look here, as we come through technology transfer and adoption, the next part is this diffusion. And this is sort of the scaling work that we take on. There are different types of scaling. So sometimes we're looking at vegetative scaling or scaling out, where maybe the same thing that works in Minnesota works in Kansas, and maybe the same thing that works in Kansas works in Wisconsin. But we also have this kind of generative scaling. So I think a really good example is that, you know, in Minnesota, we have producers who are primarily focused on the grain. Like they're really, not all of them are really interested in the fact that Kernza also produces a large biomass and that can be used as forage. Some of them have like either have cattle or have a neighbor who has dairy cattle or something like that, so they're using it, but it's really not the driver for them. It really is the grain. But in Colorado, the growers there are kind of like, yeah, maybe someday we want to get to grain production, but right now what we're really interested in is having pastures with intermediate wheatgrass that are more resilient to drought than some of the grasses that we're using now. And we're interested in Kernza because down the line we might be interested in the grain production, but right now we're really interested in the forage for our cattle. And so that is kind of an example of this scaling up, or this generative type of scaling that we see happening. There are different kinds of approaches to scaling for different levels of like social and technical complexity. And each of these operates sort of in a different way with like different times and locations happening. So we have like push scaling, which is where we have something that we want to scale and we work really hard to make that happen. We see this as like kind of what our business partners do. So we work really closely with some businesses that have centered Kernza as a part of their main business. And those folks are just like working really hard to make sure that this that their businesses go to scale. We have pull scaling, which is where you have kind of like an aspired future in mind, and we're like seeking to scale that, but we think that we have to scale up the individual pieces to make sure that that future happens. So that happens kind of more from the market side. So as the market becomes interested, we see more growers putting grain on the landscape. We have plant scaling, where we have something that we want to see go to scale, but it can only happen if we connect all of these other factors. So this is really, I think, a lot of what I was talking about with the way that Kernza is getting to scale now, where we have this innovation package, and all of that has to be kind of in place, and we have to develop a lot of that for it to move forward. And then finally we have probe scaling, which is where we have an aspired future in mind, but we don't quite know what scaling processes are going to get us there. So this is where I think a lot of the crops at TLI are, because we really haven't explored some of the scaling methodologies yet. So Kernza is maybe more kind of in this plant place, but most of the other crops are more in this probe place, where we're kind of like, we're trying to find it. So we're scaling up seeds so that we have it available for recipe development, and kind of, you know, for example, with sorghum, the first sorghum beer and whiskey were brewed this year. So that gives us some idea, like, is this crop even viable for these particular end uses, and gives us some idea of how we might work with that. But that's more of like trying to probe, like, is this going to work to scale it based on this kind of pattern or not? And then finally, we work to build legitimacy for all of these perennial grain crops. Our plant breeding programs and others really work on this scientific space. You know, our publications and things like that probably go into building legitimacy in the realm of science. But there are all of these other realms that are required. So we want to make sure that we have, like, we're gaining legitimacy in the eyes of government or legislative bodies. So that's really this policy and politics. In the legal sense, we really luckily have not had to like go through the process of judicial reasoning. So we haven't like had any lawsuits or things like that we've had to address. But with the trademark protection, like we establish a legitimacy for Kernza and for what it actually is in this way, because if there isn't a legal definition for a crop, like there wasn't for Kernza. Someone could sell rye, they could sell wheat, they could sell a bag of rocks, and they could just call it Kernza, unless you do something like build a trademark where you have then a legal definition for what that is. And then in the practical realm of building legitimacy, this is where we really work with farmers, I would say, where farmers are getting are developing best practices. They're doing a lot of experimentation and trying to figure out, what are the best ways to grow this crop in their particular geography. And then the practice becomes more legitimate because you have folks who have been successful using it in these ways. And then finally, in the civic sense, this is really looking at social movements and citizens and societies. So this is like how this is embodied by like how we're building relationships with other champions, with other nonprofits, and with other academic institutions to gain legitimacy. So again, we do research on innovation and adoption, scaling of that adoption, and then legitimacy. And this is my team kind of does all of this stuff, everything from agronomic advising. I do a lot of agronomic advising and working with growers. Our Upper Midwest Hub Coordinator works a lot with, excuse me, with producers, businesses, et cetera, and builds, it does a lot of like relationship building in the Upper Midwest, where we have a lot of work going on. And she's also does a lot of work building relationships with people of color and organizations that are led by people of color in that region. We also have a market stewardship specialist who's really working on like the development of processing and middle of the supply chain stuff. We have a person who works on policy and government affairs, so developing like a policy platform. That's a brand new position that actually just started 2 weeks ago. We have a breeder who's working on end use quality, specifically on sandpoint. So he's working on leading the process where we get what's called GRAS status, or generally recognized as safe. So for any new product that enters the market, companies want to see that it's safe for folks to eat. And so we're working on that for that crop. And then we have somebody who works on seed production and does a lot of and makes sure that we're always scaling up enough of the research seed that we can start doing kind of end use or utilization or processing research as the crops get more and more ready to go. So I want to go back to this like messy looking plot and show that, kind of this is where our team is trying to make inroads and where they live kind of in these connections that are happening between, everything from public authorities and societal groups to user groups, suppliers, producer networks, financial networks, all of these, all of our team is working kind of in these spaces where they're navigating many of these different connections between different kinds of groups. And that's what I have. I hope I can take some questions. I like to leave time for questions if at all possible. So because I know there's a lot of work and hopefully something a little bit new to think about in terms of what it might look like to be a plant breeder who doesn't do any plant breeding anymore.
Thanks, Tessa, for a great talk. You talked a little bit earlier about power sharing in these like new cropping systems you guys are developing, and you mentioned for Kernza you're leveraging the trademark on the name to like share ownership. I was curious, what are some strategies you guys are enacting for some of the other crops that the Land Institute is developing?
Yeah, well, so far none of the other crops is totally ready to go into the marketplace because we're still working on getting GRAS status, so that generally regarded as safe. But I think with Sandpoint, we probably will do something similar where I think we will probably do a trademark on a name for the grain in the marketplace. In part, you know, for that crop, sort of for different reasons. I think for Kernza, it was so new and there was sort of no legal definition for the grain. And we wanted to make sure that that like people were selling it and that there was some sort of quality control on Kernza. And I think that that's important also with Sandpoint. But the other thing that we run into is that, you know, we've really relied that Sandpoint's been grown in the US for 100 years as a forage, and there's a forage sort of seed industry, and we've been really working closely with seed producers who already know kind of how to grow Sandpoint seed and are really interested in this. And we also want to like make sure that there's a way for them to kind of have some sort of return on the investment that they've made with our researchers by having, you know, early market access. So we're not interested in exclusivity in any way, like that's kind of antithetical to our ultimate goals, but I do think it is important for us to offer maybe some sort of limited exclusivity or some way for those folks who've been early research partners to recoup on the investment that they've made in terms of time and energy with us.
Other folks have questions, Ed? Okay, great.
Tessa, thanks again for the great talk. I was wondering, the perennial rice yield is quite impressive. And I was wondering, is there any, but it was tropical. Is there any place in the U.S., the southern part of the U.S. that could grow it, or does it have any chance in the U.S. market?
I mean, we certainly hope so. So the first perennial rice was imported last year, and so it's under quarantine at APHIS to make sure that there aren't any diseases or things like that. So we've been working with I think it's Louisiana State or University. I think it's Louisiana State. And they have got it under quarantine, and we're really interested in bringing it in. And they have plant breeders who are just kind of chomping at the bit to work with it for the U.S. context. So yeah, there will definitely need to be breeding because we're much colder than the places that it's being grown now. I think it's primarily, you know, Southeast Asia. There are maybe 5 or 6 countries in Southeast Asia, and then a couple countries in West Africa where it's being grown right now. So there will need to be significant plant breeding before it would be ready for a U.S. context.
Hi, Tessa. Thank you. I'm curious, especially for Kernza, I'm picturing your barrel slide, which was very, I like that imagery. I'm curious if you can name like the weakest part, you know, of the barrel of the Kernza system at the moment.
Yeah, I think the weakest part right now is the price, because yields are low, which we don't try to hide. We're confident that yields will improve over the next, 10 to 20 years as the breeding improves. But because yields are low, the price is really high. And in particular with inflation and the price of wheat having gone up this year due to like the conflict in Ukraine, when companies when their baseline is down here, they're kind of fine paying for a higher priced crop for some kind of inclusion. But when their base price is here, this price they're really not willing to bear. And so what we're seeing now is that we have to think of new ways to encourage the adoption of the grain into the marketplace. So we're doing some creative things with just developing marketing material and storytelling and a label for companies to use so that they don't have to do all of that stuff too, which saves them a little bit on their bottom line. But also looking at, there are now government programs like the Conservation Stewardship Program that will give producers a payment for including perennial grains in their crop rotation. And so that will hopefully also translate into being able to lower the price. We're also working with USDA to develop a crop insurance program for Kernza. So all of those things hopefully will help producers not have to take the basement price, but also still be able to move that grain into the marketplace with some government help. So.
Other questions? Otherwise, I have one, Tessa. Just looking at your circle of the different crops that the Land Institute is working on, and I'm just curious about, when you're working on kind of the bleeding edge of new crops and cropping systems, and how does the Land Institute, or how do you think about how to prioritize the resources that you have available, like decide what's the highest potential new crop or cropping system, or the region that you most want to develop a crop for? Like what kind of processes does the organization go through in making that prioritization?
I think that is something that's kind of changed. So, 40 years ago, when Wes Jackson started the Land Institute, I think that it really was about Kansas, and it was about tall grass prairie ecosystems, and the goal was to mimic those ecosystems. So, having a legumes program was important because we see a lot of legumes in those natural tall grass prairie ecosystems. And so that, I think, was sort of initially how that decision would get made. As we become more interested and had more collaborators internationally, I think that to some extent, that is probably changing. Like I'm guessing that if we were going to add a new program, it would probably be about, perennial maize, because obviously that would have a huge impact on many acres. And there's a lot of resources in terms of, the genome and things like that could be utilized for breeding. So I think that, it's sort of changed. I think that it started out as being really focused on like mimicking the prairie of Kansas in particular for the context of Kansas. And now I think that the sort of mindset has shifted toward looking at broader systems for various geographic context. And I think that that's sort of new. I think I don't know how the organization's going to negotiate that necessarily in the next couple of years, but I think that there's no one who's like averse to saying like we need to be partnering more broadly, and we need to be working with other crops and supporting. We don't have a perennial flax breeding program, but we are really close collaborators with folks who do. Perennial barley similarly. We try and provide them with our understanding and knowledge of perennial plant breeding in general, and then they work on the specific crop.
Cool, thank you. That's really helpful. Anybody else have questions for Tessa?
Thank you, Tessa. I was curious, you mentioned earlier that you try to get this deep understanding of the diverse needs of the communities that you plan to deploy some of these products in. And I was curious how you balance catering to all those needs and then having a clear set of program goals. So balancing that complexity with developing a product.
I think our job is sort of to like understand and help contextualize and like and make sure that we're not over promising or telling people like these crops are going to solve your problem, right? Whatever that problem is. Like our goal is to say, try this, see how it works in your system. If it's not right for your system, like that's okay. We want to know that, we want to understand why, we want to help that. But our goal is really to help folks contextualize like why this might work, what kinds of problems we might see. I'll use the work in Colorado as an example. I don't think that Kernza uses less water than the grasses that these producers are currently growing. If the water is available, Kernza will use it, right? The grass will absolutely use it. Intermediate wheatgrass, like it will do fine with as much water as you give it. The thing that I've really tried to kind of put the research focus on is, in times when there isn't water, will Kernza survive in contexts where these other grasses won't survive? Or will it recover more quickly from that drought stress than these other grasses like Timothy or foxtail garrison or these common grasses that are being grown there? And what we're finding in initial studies is that yes, it seems like that happens. And so that's really what we're exploring. People come to me and they want to know, like, this grass is going to grow with no water. I'm like, no, obviously it's not going to grow with no water. The goal is to contextualize it for that specific context, and to explain to people why we think there's a reason to be interested in the grass.
Yeah, I wonder, is there any progress understanding the genetic basis between why the plants being perennial and annual?
Yeah, I think there is, and I'm probably not the best person to ask about it. I think, yeah, so that's a good question for like Lee DeHaan, who's the breeder who does the work on Kernza, or for Shuwen Wang, who is the perennial wheat breeder. They have been looking at the genomes of Kernza and wheat, and then the perennial wheat, which is the cross between Durham and intermediate wheatgrass, just looking for exactly those kinds of ties. And I think perenniality tends to be pretty complex. I don't, from my understanding at least, which again, I'm probably not the best person to answer this question. There might be a few big domestication genes that control perenniality, but we don't, or I guess they're not domestication genes, but perenniality genes. But I think it, from my understanding, tends to be a pretty complex set of genes that allow it.
All right. Well, Tessa, thank you so much for great presentation. And I hope folks enjoyed the discussion time before the seminar as well. And yeah, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you guys so much for listening.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.